Dominic Boyer with us. So this is a second lecture in a series of two based on the duographs, the two very important texts that have come out in 2019, Ecologics and Energopolitics, and I'll get to that briefly. So just to mention that Professor Boyer is an anthropologist specializing in energy, climate politics, and has a number of projects that I will briefly mention, but with Professor Semni Hao, who presented in our department last week, he has been working on a project on wind power development in southern Mexico, and the two books that have come out recently are based on that NSF-funded research project. He's currently researching different models of electricity provision and their social implications in Europe, the United States, and Latin America. In addition, he's working on a project on victims of Hurricane Harvey. And in the past, he's worked extensively on news journalism in Germany and the US, in particular looking at the rise of the new digital information technologies and how that has dovetailed with the rise of neoliberal media policy regimes. So in addition to the past work on media and the more recent work on wind power development in Mexico, another project that Professor Boyer is involved with Semni Hao, focuses on the social and cultural dimensions of ice loss and sea level rise in many parts of the world. And I believe Cape Town is one of the places that they are interested in looking. So we are very much looking forward to welcoming you when you come to do some research in Cape Town and to have further discussions about that. Amongst the publications are a number of interventions, including editing the book series Expertise, subtitled Cultures and Technologies of Knowledge with Cornell University Press, and Energy Humanities with Johns Hopkins University Press. In addition, he is he's leading this editorial collective of the journal Cultural Anthropology. Either was or still is, I'm not sure. Was, okay. Till 2018, more or less, is that right?
Exactly.
And Professor Boyer is the author of Spirit and System, Medium Intellectuals and the Dialectic in Modern German Intellectual Culture, Chicago University Press, 2005. Understanding Media, Popular Philosophy, published in 2007. The Life Informatic, published with Cornell University Press in 2013. And the current book is titled Energopolitics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene. And finally, because I'm not going to go through the long list of publications, it's an extraordinary list, and I've noted, I've read a few of the publications on, for example, Nostalgia and the Politics of the Future in East Germany in the past, because I have an interest in Germany for various reasons, and also another publication in Ethnos called Foucault in the Bush, The Social Life of Post-Structuralist Theory in East Berlin's Prenzlauer Berg. So we have met that way before through those publications, and now I've had the privilege to engage with the more recent work. And in addition, finally, I really enjoyed the Cultures of Energy podcast, which I listened to extensively before COVID when I was driving to work, because I live in Cape Town and I drive an hour to work, and that made my driving to work absolutely fantastic. So I will now hand over, and thank you very much, Dominic, for been available so early in the morning in the US at Rice University, where he's currently based in the Department of Anthropology. And we're looking forward to a discussion after the presentation of roughly 40 minutes. And we have two discussants who will follow your presentation, and then we'll open it up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for such a warm and wonderful introduction, and thanks to all for joining at what I understand is also a slightly askew time outside the usual time for seminars. So this is very kind of you to make that adjustment too, in the kindness of not having me up at truly before dawn, sitting in the dark talking to you. So very kind indeed. So, as mentioned, this is part of a duograph. I'm going to present on my volume. For those of you who were able to see Simone's talk last week, then you may have a more complete sense of the project as a whole. But indeed, the whole concept of the duograph was to write two single-authored volumes that derive from the same fieldwork experience and the same archive of ethnographic data. And that is a bit of an experimental project in collaborative writing that I'd be happy to talk about more later. But I think in terms of what I might say before diving into my slide deck is just that this term, Energopolitics, which is one that I coined in a sort of loose inspiration from Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics. I just want to explain a little bit the thought process behind that concept, because I think it may help to inform, some of what comes later on in my presentation. So very briefly, Foucault's concept of the biopouvoir, biopolitics, biopower, is a concept that has had, I think, a pretty tremendous influence in the anthropology of modernity, particularly this conceptualization of a certain politics of life and population. And in the book, I talk quite a lot about the biopolitical ambitions that are connected to wind power in Mexico. But then in the course of my research, I came to feel that, and here I'm inspired by folks like Timothy Mitchell and his marvelous project Carbon Democracy, that as much as there's a genealogy of the politics of life and population going on in this case, that there's also a genealogy of energy, fuel, electricity, that's part of the making of modernity that I wanted to highlight with this concept. And the thing I would say, especially for those of us who work in an English language environment, is that there's a tendency to see something like power as a noun, whereas in the tradition, the sort of more Latinate tradition that Foucault is working in, pouvoir is not only a noun, but it's also a modal verb. Est-ce que je peux quelque chose? So you are able to do something. And this is also the term analogous to the term poder for power in Spanish, which is also a modal verb, the ability to do something. So when I'm thinking of power and politics in this case, I'm thinking of them as a form of enablement. And the question I'm interested in is what kinds of modern political projects, institutions, and practices do particular configurations of energy enable? And this is a question that's germane to the context, the fieldwork context, because it's part of a project of decarbonization that is, really truly a global project, and a project that in certain respects Mexico has really been a leader in, as I'll discuss in a moment. And the idea is to move away from a sort of petro-political order, the order that has gifted us, a certain kind of global modernity, but also a deeply ecologically unsustainable one that is creating mounting forms of environmental catastrophe around us. So we need to transition from this political order to a new one, as yet to be determined, that may focus more on renewable sources and hydropolitics, aeolian politics, the politics of wind, as we discuss in the duograph. And the question is, what kinds of political institutions, practices both enable these energy transition, but also what does the energy transition itself enable? And this is where you raise questions about what kind of future world political, social worlds we want to inhabit? And is it possible to use this energy transition as a way to create a more equitable and just and sustainable form of modernity? So these are the questions at the heart of the project, and I just want to lay them out there briefly at the beginning. And from that, I will delve into the field research and talk about the two case studies that really made up my volume of the project. So there was a division of labor, if you will, conceptually, between Simony's interest in ecological matters and human, non-human relationships, and in my interest in thinking about power and politics in this situation as well too. But we also had a division of labor in terms of field sites, because it was quite a generative study with a lot going on, and we felt that we couldn't do it justice unless we had some division of labor. So she probably, for those of you who heard it, talked to you at some length about the Moreña Renovables project, which was for sure the most attention-getting and significant project that was going on. The political contests around this project were quite fierce. But I'm going to tell you about two smaller projects that I think are also illustrative of the politics of wind in southern Mexico today. Both, I'm going to tell you about a little town that's surrounded entirely by wind turbines now and how people feel about that, and then also about an effort to create a different trajectory to wind development, one that's led by community wind parks instead of wind parks that are developed in the private-public partnership model. Essentially, transnational wind companies work with large Mexican and international corporations to create carbon offsets. So a lot to cover, and I'll just dive right in now. So this is the part of the world we're talking about, the isthmus of Tehuantepec, seen from satellite. And you can see in the center of the screen that there is a kind of a gap between the Sierra Madre Mountains. And that gap is in the geography of the region is what this story is all about, because it allows for the barometric pressure differential between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean to create a natural wind tunnel effect that in the winter months can flirt with tropical storm force without there being any kind of cyclonic or storm system available. So it's so strong that it can literally rip the paint off boats. It can mangle tractor trailers. It's an incredibly powerful wind. Very rare to find a sustained terrestrial wind pattern like this. In fact, the only other place in the world that has wind this strong is in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's an extraordinary wind resource, and it's a place that has historically been a resource frontier, a place where colonial imaginations of extracting resources and labor has run very deep. So you can go back to the 16th century and the Spanish conquest, or to the 19th century and the United States' various imperial ambitions in this part of the world, and see a pretty unbroken context for colonial ventures in resource exploitation. For example, and I'll just mention one thing that probably is not well known. It's not even well known here in the United States, but it's very well remembered in this part of Mexico, that there was a treaty signed shortly before the American Civil War that would have transferred the Isthmus of Tehuantepec over to the United States as a protectorate to create what eventually would become the Panama Canal Zone. This was another site where a trans-Isthmian waterway was envisaged. And the only reason this faltered was the Mexicans had signed it away. Mexican president at the time, Benito Juarez, had signed it away. And it was and the fact that the developers were based in New Orleans at a time when the northern states were fearing the growth of Southern power, that the treaty wasn't ratified. So it's very possible in another world that we would be talking about this as a kind of Panama zone rather than as a part of Mexico. And people in the isthmus have not forgotten this betrayal, this attempt to literally sell their lands to foreign powers. And so the suspicion and mistrust in the isthmus for the political machinations in Mexico City and Oaxaca City runs very deep. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But for those of you who read the book, in my chapter 5, I talk about this in quite some length, how the need to understand the colonial history of the isthmus and the political conflicts to understand the powerful sense of identity and indigenous purpose there. as well as part of the suspicion of these foreign-led development programs. You may have seen this image in somebody's presentation too. This was a mapping of the wind potential in Oaxaca that was undertaken by yet another foreign power, the USAID, as well as the U.S. Department of National Renewable Energy Lab, the NREL, they call it. And the reason I want to point this out to you is just to give you a sense of the resource. Where you see red and a kind of a deep purple, and you see it's most of the area in the southern isthmus is coated in those colors. You are literally beyond excellent if you look over at the wind power classification chart. This is off the charts wind potential. And this helps to explain part of why so many international wind developers were interested in this land, and part of why the Mexican government made it a priority and a pillar of their national renewable energy strategy. But it's not just that. I want to acknowledge also that Mexico itself, although a petrostate, has seen real challenges to that model in recent years. Mexican oil production, a very crucial pillar of their biopolitical mission, supplying as much as 43% of the Mexican federal government budget through the Pemex, which is the state-owned utility, has declined, as you see, by nearly half in just the past 15 years. And so this is creating a budgetary crisis as well as a crisis of imagination, so that even the case of the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, or AMLO as he's known, who came on a sort of a populist platform, a populist left-leaning sort of peasant, lower class leaning platform, a little bit in the spirit of Hugo Chavez, has also, like Chavez, really clung to petroleum as being part of Mexico's future. So there's a deep sense of denial about in countries like Mexico about the end of oil, and this has in many ways complicated their transition politics. But I'm going to talk to you instead about the work of a previous president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, who really was himself an environmental minister before he became president, and who during his 6-year term really pushed Mexico to become a leader, not just in the global south, but in the whole world in terms of renewable energy transition. And I want to show you a little bit what his platform involved, his general law on climate that his administration pushed through in 2012. It mandated, and again, these aren't targets, they're legally binding mandates. 35% of Mexico's energy was mandated to come from clean energy sources by 2024, with 50% of that to come from wind power alone, as well as a number of other initiatives I've laid out here. Just to say, these would be quite impressive targets today, let alone in 2012. And just to give you a sense of how far Calderón was ahead of sort of global consensus on climate change and really pushing Mexico to be a leader. This is part of what attracted us to this study, why we wanted to study renewable energy development in Mexico, was that Mexico was really positioning itself to be a world leader in this sector. But how could it be done? Well, there's a bit of history to tell, and that's first of all, this project predates Calderón's presidency, to be sure. The first studies of wind power were done during Mexico's energy boom in the 1970s. That is, of course, a petroleum boom, when it was discovered that you could find wind speeds that, as noted in the previous slide, were extraordinary. The presidents Salinas and Zedillo, who are often, castigated these days for the neoliberalization of Mexican government and economy. One thing that they did do that was relevant to clean energy legislation was to open the electrical sector to foreign investment. And so the first CFE is the parastatal federal electricity utility. It opened a kind of test wind park at the town of Laventosa, which went on grid in 1994 and showed an extraordinary plant capacity of 50%. What plant capacity is the ratio between the theoretical generation of electricity from a wind park and what it actually generates. Today, at the very successful wind parks in West Texas, they would be quite thrilled to have a plant capacity of 35%. So the fact that they were delivering 50% with much more primitive technology was something that attracted attention again from the world over. A major lobbying agency named AMDI was founded in 2004, and they worked together with the Oaxacan state government, which is where the isthmus is, to make a development push. And this is part of what attracted us to Mexico in the first place, was the Oaxacan government's promotion of Oaxaca and the isthmus as a future of clean energy. And in the time when we started the project in 2009 and completed the main period of fieldwork in 2013, during that time, 13 wind parks came onto the grid. Most of them, as I said, these industrial self-supply projects where a Cemex or a Walmart or a FEMSA Heineken would contract to have a wind park created so that they could create a carbon offset for themselves and perhaps green their corporate image a little bit. But that energy was being sold into the CFE grid as the only entity allowed to sell electricity in Mexico. And that created quite a significant amount of installed capacity. And by 2016, the isthmus hosts the densest concentration of onshore wind parks anywhere in the world. So this is, again, extraordinary within a period of only 7 years, from basically one very small wind park to the densest onshore concentration in the world. 2.3 gigawatts of installed capacity in an area of roughly 450 square kilometers, with ambitions still to extend that to 5 gigawatts or beyond. But that development project stalls after 2016 for many reasons, but really a lot of it has to do with the contentious politics in the region that Semini and I write about in the duograph. So there are about 2.8 gigawatts of wind power in Oaxaca today, but the plans for extensive additional development have more or less, sort of ground to a halt, although Mexico is developing wind resources elsewhere. Okay, so the first of these two studies I want to talk to you about is Laventosa, which is one of two towns, along with the aforementioned La Venta, that are now completely surrounded by wind parks. And I want to show this to you again from this is just a Google Google's image, but the wind parks are circled in red, and you can see the town of Laventosa in the center. And it really is, entirely encircled by wind parks now. And this is something that has created both a range of opinions, to be fair. And we did a survey door to door in Laventosa, knocking on every single house that we could, together with a team of local researchers, to ask people, and it was the first time they had been asked, many of them, how do you feel about this wind development? I want to share some of the results from that survey in a little minute, but I'm first going to show you a few more images of Laventosa. Here you can see a bit closer up the scale of the town, and population estimates range, but probably somewhere in the area of 7,000 inhabitants. And when we move now to the streets, you begin to get a better sense of what the house is like. Most single story, cinder block construction, in some cases still a kind of mud and thatch construction, especially in some of the poorer parts of town. Here you can see on the fringes, you see the wind parks in the distance, and this is kind of one of the humbler homes in town that if you notice on the image, you can see that there's several large bricks that are holding the roof on, the simple metal roof. And this, in fact, again, is sort of deference to the wind and the power of the wind, which can carry away a rooftop with very little trouble. Now I'll see if this works. This is the only little bit of video I wanted to show, just to give you a sense if it works. And I'm sorry if there's latency issues and it lags, but it may give you a little sense of the strength of the wind. This is not an unusual day in Laventosa. You again see the wind turbines in the background, but through the blowing trees and other indices, you get a sense of the power of the wind, as well as, despite the fact that the camera's on a tripod, how much it's shaking. So I'll give this just a few seconds. There you go. So if it didn't work, then just it's powerful. Powerful wind. You'll have to take my word for it. Here's more evidence of the power of the wind. This is an utterly routine event on the road between La Venta and Laventosa, especially in the winter months, where just the local newspapers every day or two will have a picture of a mangled tractor trailer. In this case, it's a transport of couches that ended up being stored on one of our friends' veranda while they sought a new truck to come in and rescue them. But so this is it's wind that the people in the region have known about its strength for years. There's a mythology, a cosmology associated with it that I'm happy to go into. But it wasn't until the work of one Don Porfirio Montero, he pictured here, evangelical Christian leader and political leader who really took it upon himself to organize the landowners of the area in favor of wind development, and really to work together with the Oaxacan government, and also to sort of push the Oaxacan government to reach out to wind companies. And probably as much as anybody in the Laventosa area, Montero deserves credit for having been a catalyst behind the development of wind. He also runs the largest regional evangelical Christian gathering, La Gran Fiesta. And you see here, I just wanted to show you a couple of images, promotional images associated with those events, to show you how seamlessly the world of renewable energy sort of meshes into the evangelical Christian imagination here too. So this is about prosperity, it's about development, it's about hard work. Montero himself, is somebody who has been able to develop a fairly comfortable rentier existence by organizing the acquisition of land in the area by himself and his allies in advance of the major period of development. So he bought up a lot of the best plots for himself. I want to show you in the next case study, though, that this model of land use is not the only one that exists in the isthmus. In fact, there are 3 different land tenure systems that are uneasily coexisting. One, a private property regime that actors like Montero have promoted very aggressively. There is also a ejido system, which is a system that was created after the Mexican Revolution and institutionalized in the 1930s to give land from former colonial estates back to landless peasants. And so peasant collectives are ejidos, but they were neoliberalized in the 1990s and allowed to again break apart their collective land and to privatize it. So that's been very controversial, as you can imagine. The third type of land tenure system is indigenous collectives, which have certain rights guaranteed by the Mexican Constitution of 1917. They are inalienable in theory, that if an indigenous community has an unbroken record of habitation and cultural practices associated with a particular area, in theory, then it can be expropriated by the state. However, in practice, it's been much messier, as you can imagine. And the question of sort of the politics of indigenous comunas or communal land estates is something that we'll take up again in the next case. But here's a few more images of Laventosa. First, this paving project was undertaken with the help of one of the wind companies. And the only thing I want to note about it was that people were very happy that this pavement was being laid, because you can imagine what the wind such as that kicks up in terms of dust and stones, and the idea of paving was very attractive to many people. But you can see here that there's actually no drainage system associated with this pavement. So critics said, this is a kind of a social work that's being done on the cheap. It's actually creating other problems, because now southern Mexico, like many parts of the world, is seeing longer and more intense rainfall bursts. And now they're beginning to experience flooding for the first time in the town's history, as a lot of that impermeable surface collects water on top that then flows into homes. So this is becoming, in other words, they've replaced one problem with another, in part again because the nature of the social work was done, with attention only to one set of environmental factors, let's see. But again, at the time we were working in Laventosa in 2012 and 2013, this paving process was going on. And you can see here, Eolico, Papeleria, paper store, with taking on images of the wind turbines. A lot of local businesses found ways to sort of help define a community image that was associated with sort of the land of the wind turbines, or the village of the wind turbines. And like this, here's another home in which somebody had a creative soul had built a small addition to his home out of some styrofoam and wooden parts associated with the packaging materials of aspect of certain parts of wind turbines. So people are finding interesting ways to recycle and to involve in the sort of material world of wind production. But here's the survey. The results of this were not surprising to us based on the interviews we did in the area, but they helped to give you some broader sense of both what people hoped to gain from wind power and also what they found in retrospect it had actually offered. So we asked the question, when you first heard about the wind parks coming, did you think this would be a good thing? And you see that it's not that everyone did. There was a lot of uncertainty about this form of development, but that you had close to 40% of respondents said they thought it would be good. We asked whether they thought it would be good, not just for the community, but for their family specifically. And they're even slightly more encouraging. The people felt close to 44% of people thought they could gain some work from this, or that the income coming from the rents would trickle down to their families too, in the forms perhaps of more economic development and growth. And in general, people hoped not only for new sources of work, as well as some kinds of modernization. Again, the pavement was one thing people talked about, but also the hope that it would bring cheaper electricity. People believed and thought it was just that if we were going to live in the village with these wind turbines, then our electricity should be subsidized, thus allowing us, again, access to a greater range of appliances and conveniences that are associated with electrification the world over. But those who were concerned about the parks cited a wide range of concerns. They were worried about the health consequences of having so many wind turbines around them. They weren't sure about that, as well as the fact that many anticipated that there would be an increased social inequality, as the landowners would be the ones who would receive the greatest share of the income, and that you would find further political polarization traveling in its wake. So a second set of questions asked about whether the parks had brought their family the benefits they hoped they would. And there it was definitely a more definitive answer of 60% of people saying no. Have the wind companies provided enough in the way of investment for the good of the town? Again, even more decisive no, 2/3 saying no. Has the government provided enough in the way of investment for the good of the town? Still more definitive, almost 84% of people said no. So the government was definitely singled out for the most acidic remarks about their marginalization. But again, put in the context of this deeper colonial history, as I mentioned at the beginning, perhaps that's somewhat unsurprising. As it turned out, those who supported the parks tended to be from families who either owned land that was rented to energy companies or who worked in the construction industry and received contracts. Again, the critics felt that the parks had made social inequality worse, that they had created crime and political instability as fights over the wind parks intensified. Montero was obviously the leader of the pro-wind camp, but there were many who were organizing themselves both in Laventosa and in the region more widely to critique this rapid industrialization of the area. And I should mention here also that another issue somebody may have spoken about was concerns about food security, that this formerly agricultural region, that much of the land was being converted now into wind power. Of course, it's theoretically possible to match wind turbines together with agriculture and ranching, and some people did, but there was a general feeling that once people were earning these revenues from the wind, they were much less interested in farming and ranching and sort of more comfortable with a rentier existence. And some of the landowners themselves criticized their peers for this, meaning that actually the price, for example, of corn had gone up substantially, local corn in the area. Now, a few more quotes from folks who invited us into their homes to talk more about the issues. Victor says, "My country is a very nice place with a lot of solidarity, but when money is involved, it's like a bomb going off. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everyone comes apart." Kane, who was a landowner and again critical of the impact that the wind development had upon the landowners. He said, "So much money divides people. It's divided our people. The money only goes to people who have land. And I think the easy money has made the landowners lazy. There are people who just live on the rents now. For me, I live from my cattle. I have my ranch. But our way of life has already changed into something that is different." And then Roosevelt, a local journalist, in fact, a member of Montero's extended family, but a good friend who was willing to speak, openly with us about his concerns. And he pointed out that that he was concerned by the fact that the whole town is encircled by turbines now. I'm looking at this and saying to myself, how is this going to grow? How is this town going to grow? There are rules about building homes closer than 500 meters to the turbines. It's not possible to grow the population much more than it is today. It's like we are the victims of our own success. So people had some concerns about the future of the village based on the success of wind development, the fact that in a sense they had created this casket of renewable energy development around themselves that would prevent the town from continuing to prosper over the longer term. And this is example of just a couple of the buildings that were built on the strength of the rents that were associated with the wind parks. You see quite a different architecture appearing here. No longer do we have the humble cinder block single floor homes, but much larger homes. But these are again for single families, and they were concerns that a lot of the money was not going back into the community, into projects like this, but instead was relocated into second homes or third homes in Mexico City, homes in Acapulco and Huatulco for other wealthy families. So that in a sense, there was actually a drawing of resources out of the region alongside this wind development. Okay. So let me pivot now to talking about Ixtepec, my second case. And this is a very different case in the sense that it was an indigenous agrarian farming collective that came up with the idea together with an NGO to fight against the dominant model of wind development and to create a community-owned wind park, which would have been the first community-owned wind park anywhere in Latin America had it been built according to the schedule that they planned. It still hasn't been built. Like the Morenia project, you could think of this as a failed venture, but it is illustrative and indicative of the politics of wind in the isthmus now. And I'm just going to show you a couple of images here of some of the graffiti that shows you how many people, critics of wind development, have depicted this development as a new kind of invasion, a new invasion of foreigners seeking to extract resources. To take the very wind itself away from the isthmus. So this says, get out, invaders. Here you have a Don Quixote figure where his lance is a wind turbine, and it says concession is the same as colonization. There was in the local town of Juchitán, which I again talk about in chapter 5 of my book, an popular assembly developed itself using a lot of imagery associated with popular revolutions of the past to fight to save the resources, the air, the sea, the land of the isthmus against foreign invaders. And this, which is an image on a little side street in Laventosa, is actually one of the most powerful images that I think I've saw by a local artist that shows this imagination of wind turbines presiding over a land that's been deprived of its fecundity, where wind turbines are depicted as sort of shriveled stalks, and a young indigenous person is trying to extract some nutrition from the dried corn, which has been replaced again by these wind turbines. I think it gives you a powerful sense of the way in which this development is interpreted by many as being extractive, which again, for those of us, and Simony, I'm sure, said this as well, we are, renewable energy advocates. We went to the isthmus as advocates for energy transition, and we came away as advocates, but we realize that it matters entirely how this development is done. You can do wind parks in a way that is very much like oil exploration or fracking. That there are ways to do renewable energy right, and there are ways to do it wrong. And unfortunately, much of what was happening in Mexico was felt to be dispossessive. But the Ixtepec project was an exception. So I like to use it as an example of there are possibilities here, but unfortunately those possibilities tend to be shut down by the power brokers associated with these large developments where a lot of money is to be made. So the Jansa Ixtepec project is a project of an alliance between a small NGO, Jansa, and then the Ixtepec and Comuna, and the idea was to build, a wind park that would be quite unique in isthmus as elsewhere in Latin America, on the model of the Danish community-owned wind power. And really trying to be the first kind of Danish model project in Mexico. And the idea of the project was not only to green Mexico's electricity, but also to create a future for Ixtepecan youth beyond their agrarian and military past. Ixtepec happens to be the largest military base in southern Mexico, and if you're interested why, I talk a little bit about that in the book. So there's a little bit of data on the park project itself, how it would have worked. It would have cost 4.3 billion pesos to construct, which the project organizers, especially the NGO head, were quite convinced that could be raised easily on the basis of European social investment. It would have created 102 megawatts of electricity, and 50% of the annual profits would be set aside in a trust established by the communal assembly to fund a retirement scheme for farmers, but also new investments in women's and youth projects. And this was a striking gap because the profit return for most of the privately financed wind parks was only about 2%. So the difference was between a model that returned 50% of its profits to the community and one that returned only 2%. And so, as you can imagine, were such a project to be allowed to proceed and were it to succeed, it would create a rather existential crisis for all of the privately financed parks, who then would likely have their local partners demanding an explanation for why they weren't being also given 50% of their profits. And unfortunately, pressure was applied both by the private industry as well as by the Mexican government, both at the state and the federal levels, to deny the Jansa Ixtepec project, even the right to bid for grid access. And basically the argument was, this is a poor farming community. They don't have the funds to do this themselves. We don't think that they are like a legitimate development partner. And although they knew that it was unlikely that they would win through the standard procedures, they hoped that by creating pressure upon the government and by raising awareness of this alternative, they could at least be granted an exemption and being given a chance to show that this model could work, which would have gained a lot more community acceptance. They felt, and we agreed, that this park model probably would not have created some of the same kinds of contention that the Morena project, for example, did. They took it to court. They argued that the CFE had built a substation illegally on their land, kind of a squatter piece of grid infrastructure. Although this went on for many years and in some ways has never really been formally resolved, no one has conceded anything. What has happened, as I said, instead is that the development projects have moved out of the area without resolving the issue of whether community wind was a viable alternative. It raised issues that even attracted the attention of the UN Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Rights at the time, James Anaya, who came to the isthmus to sort of investigate what was going on there, and wrote a pretty scathing report about the fact that the consultation process that the private wind parks were using for the most part, violated the spirit of informed consent, that generally communities would be presented with plans and just said accept or reject with no real input into the design process or into how the proceeds from parks would be redistributed. And so, in many ways, this possibility of a kind of Ixtepecan model it still hangs out there as a possibility of a yet unexplored future, but one that for those who would like to think that the interests of the global interest in decarbonization could be matched together with a sense of creating sustainable, equitable futures, it still is there as a model for a different way of doing things that we think ought to be taken seriously still. So this is really my final slide in which I summarize much of what I've said in terms of the different range of actors that's involved. We have the Mexican petrostate, its carbon democracy, as Timothy Mitchell might say, trying to create a new stable basis for governance in the Anthropocene, trying to secure its projects of biopolitical enablement to replace petroleum revenues, and to actually find a way to bring the isthmus of Tehuantepec more securely into the nation, despite a long and contentious history. There are the issues of the capital forces, and as you see, if you've read the book, particularly chapter 4 on Mexico City, we talk about our the interviews we did with the financiers in the industry who explained to us how lucrative indeed the conventional model of wind development is, and how they view the project of development as essentially buying the consent of those communities in the isthmus. The Isthmian communities themselves that have long been positioned as a kind of violent indigenous opponent to the nationalist projects and Oaxacan state projects of settler governance. Those wind parks created, and this again is a story that's told, I think, in much more dramatically in Simone's volume, but a kind of indigenous political renaissance that many communities that were touched by the Morenia Renovables project in particular began to create the new but ancient at the same time indigenous political institutions, usos y costumbres, as they're called in Mexico, an alternative to the liberal democratic representative politics that we're more familiar with, a kind of community-led politics that manifested in new assemblies, in new indigenous security forces, and new indigenous radio stations, all of which were trying to strengthen indigenous community in the face of what they saw to be an existential threat from this very rapid period of wind development. It's a complicated situation. I can't say that we in any sense have been able to accomplish anything other than hopefully communicating more widely the complexity of the political situation on the ground. We do, in the final report to NSF, talk a little bit about what might have made the wind power developmental process more just and equitable. It's not to say the Ixtepec model is perfect, but we thought that it represents a much better model forward than the model that's created so much contention in the area. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'm sure you have questions along those lines. I'm seeing that I'm about at the end of my time, so I'll just shift to my final slide here and just say that here are the volumes. And my understanding is that you have your hands on these, or you could easily get your hands on these. They exist in open access form. And I would encourage you to read them and to engage, reach out if you have comments even beyond our session today. We'd love to hear from you. With that, I'll turn it back over to y'all.
Thanks very much, Dominic. Great. Matthew, do you want to go ahead and facilitate the discussion? Great.
Absolutely. Firstly, I'll just make the first comment. That was excellent, and I'm sure there will be a lot of comments. So Sophia and Carla are our discussants. Sophia, do you want to go first, and then Carla?
Sure, I'll go right ahead. I just wanted to say, Dominic, thank you so much. It's been a privilege to virtually meet you and interact on your research on your book, which I've really enjoyed reading. I think that your work is a really fascinating way that these concepts of the political arise out of empirical, especially when it's concerning something so central to contemporary thought, how to combat climate change and decarbonization, and which is often something perceived as, epitomizing growth and sustainability and prosperity and modern development, often established in a neutral way. And reading your book, it shows that practically it actually antithetically reproduces a kind of colonial politics. And so I want to ask, in your book, you emphasize the importance of recognizing a kind of localization of Aeolian politics, looking at particularities in specific contexts, and of not overshadowing these particularities and falling into kind of a universalized anthropocentric critique. However, this resistance narrative that you speak about is prevalent in communities impacted by renewable energy development initiatives worldwide, especially in South Africa. I wanted to ask you about the applications of this renewable energy problematic of exploitation, where colonial politics are implicated in validating the repression of affected communities and reproducing oppressive hierarchies, and with the division of land, especially bringing in a kind of settler paternalism, which you write about in chapter 5, apply this to a different but similar context like South Africa. Here we find this similar antithetical extractive agenda of supposed renewable energy plants geared towards this growth rhetoric. In what ways would this energo power manifest within a South African context, and in what ways would it be similar or different? And then a follow-up question, which maybe I should ask after you respond, is what would the ultimate solution be to formulate, I think what you call in your book, a lossless infrastructure, with a kind of a win-win-win situation for all parties for a more equitable future in this reapplied context? And what type of community empowerment could be entailed by investigating this reapplication?
Those are lovely questions, Sophia. Thank you so much for posing them. Now, on the details of the South African situation, I'm going to plead a certain degree of ignorance, because it was interesting that there were some South African union members who came to the isthmus to work together with the Jansa group, interested particularly in thinking about alternatives, I think, to fracking. And I know the fracking debate in South Africa has been a very, very powerful one. And I think that, again, thinking about community wind as potentially an alternate future for energy supply in South Africa is something that I believe also is an active conversation too. But I'm going to plead ignorance on some of the details and say that this is one of the many reasons we're looking forward to being able to come to South Africa to learn more and to understand more about your local terroir, so to speak. But to your first question, or the first part of the question, I think that this really does raise a question, and it's a problem of scale at some level as well as time. We know and we hear, and it's true, that we need to undertake a rapid decarbonization of the global economy in order to stave off the worst scenarios of environmental damage and I think catastrophe. I use the language of climate emergency quite comfortably. I think that is where we are. So the problem is that if and this is something that has, I think, been notably pointed to by a number of indigenous scholars. I'm thinking indigenous scholars in the United States who have talked about the mischief associated with what they call settler apocalypticism. This is Kyle Powys White, in particular, a Potawatomi philosopher who's talked about this. In other words, this idea that, well, because things have gotten so bad, we have to undertake this process of transition as fast as possible. And of course, the best way to do that is to do it in a massively scaled, rapid way. And because we already have a variety of capitalist institutions ranging from finance capital to kind of local sort of land exploitation practices, we have to use all of those techniques. All of the things that made it necessary to build wind parks in the first place are now being applied to sort of solve the problem of climate change. And obviously, it's a perverse way of thinking about the problem. I mean, there's a lot of perversities now, as you know, the geoengineering discussions or carbon sequestration discussions, especially in places like Texas, where the idea of carbon sequestration is to force carbon underground in order to pump more oil out. It's exactly that type of thinking. It's like applying the same poison to cure the illness. That's the issue. And this is, there has to be a transition. I couldn't agree more, but it has to be a transition that is one that is that works in a fundamentally decentralized way, that is not that is about engaging communities across the world in terms of thinking about how they view their own futures, what they would like to see in a more sustainable modernity, and moving from that base rather than from top down state and capital market inspired activity. And I think there's a role. I think there's a role for good government in this, and I do think that there are aspects of, for example, what the federal government was planning in Mexico that could have been quite good had they been realized in a different way. It wasn't so much the logic of it that was a problem, so much as the kinds of networks of enablement, the energopolitical basis of it that was problematic, which was, again, working within this so-called green capitalist model to affect the development of the parks as quickly as possible. I think what people like Kyle Powys-White would say is that we shouldn't cling too closely to this world that's dying, because the world that's dying deserves to die. I mean, he's basically said that. What we should be focused on instead is how to build the good relationships of trust and the good non-human human relationships that are necessary to build a better world. And that project may look a little different in different places. And this is why I think your question is right on point, because you're saying that, in fact, yes, this exploitation that's happening in Mexico is specific to Mexico, but it's also not specific to Mexico. You can find analogies to it across the world. And I think that's a very important point that you're making. But I would say that that doesn't necessarily mean that the remedies will look the same in all cases. And there may be different configurations because of different colonial histories, because of different aspirations that might mean that renewable energy looks different in different places. And it's not just in Africa. It's also been in India, for example, that massive solar parks have faced similar challenges and senses of dispossession from local communities and farmers. And in part, what we found in Mexico, and I really want to emphasize this, is people were not against wind power per se. They were very clear, like, this is not because we hate wind power. This is because we hate the model that is building this wind power, because we see it as continuous with projects of extractivism and dispossession that have been going on here for centuries. And they think they're going to fool us every time they say this new thing is going to be good for you, and always it's the same stuff, right? One of the activists that similarly writes about, Bettina Cruz, said, people talk about change. I don't see change. I see, more Walmarts and more, sort of commercially oriented things that are coming on the basis of this development. That's not change. Show me where the real change is. And that sense of radical democratic possibility, I think, has been articulated in connection with renewable energy by a figure that I find very helpful to think with, and he's a German, I'll be honest. Hermann Scheer, who I write about a bit in my book, was one of the architects of Germany's very radical shift to solar energy back about a little over 15 years ago, the so-called Energiewende, or energy change. And Scheer saw that fossil fuels and nuclear fuels have these incredibly long, inefficient supply chains that then necessitate a global politics that's based upon resource extraction and management. And an energy system that's based on solar and wind doesn't have that same kind of material infrastructural necessity and inefficiency associated with it. But it has to be optimized to local use. In other words, solar resources, wind resources work best at a hyperlocal level. And as such, it really began to imagine what, for example, energy provision could look like in the future, where we don't necessarily have a widely inefficient national grid, which it sounds like you're suffering through a little bit too, but a much more robust, decentralized series of energy resources and uses that are under control by by local democracy too. So Scheer is a little bit of a utopian on this idea of solar democracy, I would agree, but I do think it's a better model overall, and it's one that I think ultimately is the one that's going to win out over the inefficiencies of grid and massive and pipeline systems and all the other systems that are associated with petromodernity. So I'm sorry for a rambling response to your question, Sophia, but it was an excellent and very provocative question.
Thank you. I'll be sure to look up Scheer. Much appreciated.
Great. Carla, do you want to pose your question or thoughts?
Yes.
Go
Hello. My question actually follows on from you used the word ramble, so I'll just go with that. It didn't sound like a ramble to me. But yeah, so Hermann Scheer, you say, is super talks about this idea of a carbon democracy, but you also say that he kind of has a lot of opposition there's kind of opposition to these ideas because of the political situation that we're in now. So I feel like my question is not as well put and thought out as Sophia's, but what I really enjoyed about your book is the basically the central question, and how it brings together futures, politics, potentialities for ways of being, and how that's related to energy. And as you said, like although we're having alternative energy sources, they're being used in a way which doesn't kind of allow other potentials of being and knowing in the world. We're kind of using them in the same way that we've used oil, for instance, and using these resources in ways where we can use them, where it is possible to change this kind of dynamic, is, like you showed in your second case study, is not possible really, or not supported at the moment within the political, economic, and I guess energy politics that we live in today. But then it kind of feels like that leads to a question, which is like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So do we change the current political structures, or do we change the energy structures? And I was just hoping like you could maybe shed some more light in that way, because for me it feels like a dead end, but I'm sure for you it doesn't.
Well, thank you so much for a question, and thank you for the honesty of the feeling that, which a lot of, just on that emotional moment, you can imagine if you teach energy and climate issues the way that I do, you encounter, especially from younger people, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of gloom about the future, which is all, I think, absolutely honest emotions to have about the situation we find ourselves in. I would be, if I were your age, I would be filled with rage about the situation that I was being handed down, which was, when I was your age, I was living in the Cold War, living with the fear of nuclear annihilation. I was angry about that, right? But as it turns out, in some ways, the reckonings with somehow with climate change and the other trajectories of the Anthropocene seem even more existentially unsettling in some ways. But what I will say to that, and it really does get to, I hope, to the heart of your question, is that this is a project of civilizational renewal. We have to think about it as my friend Royce Granton wrote a book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, said, this is, the sooner we accept that this civilization is dead and that we need to sort of work with humility and purpose to sort of rebuild out of it something more sustainable, the better off we'll be, rather than trying to, again, as White would put it, sort of cling to a broken world that only ever, really, to be honest, it only ever provided security, luxury, and happiness to a very small number of people, right? People in the global north, and then specifically white men of a certain social class, right? Really, that's the only people who really ever benefited from the current system. That is a sort of astounding minority when you look at it in terms of the human population as a whole. So this civilizational project is one that's going to require all of us. But the good thing about it is, or what I find to be the hopeful thing about it, is that it actually is a unique kind of opportunity to build a better world, because this one is breaking and falling apart. There's no other way to describe it. It can't sustain itself. It's hallucinatory to think that we're going to be able to keep growing endlessly. But then, so you think, well, that's very unsettling. We've grown up for now decades with this model of growth is health. It's health at the national level, it's health at the international level, it's health at the level of household economy. but no longer can growth be, the future. So what does degrowth look like? And that's a creative project. That is a social project. That's an imaginative project. That's something that both invites and demands that we engage with the process of creating a new kind of world. And probably we would like it to be a modern world in a lot of ways. We would like to have some of the conveniences and luxuries we have that poured over. The prophets of fossil fuels are always saying, well, if you don't do it our way, you're going to lapse back into savagery again. And that's just simply not true. It's simply not true. As it turns out, petromodernity has created all sorts of pleasures and distractions, but most of it's pretty frivolous when you look at what we spend that energy on, right? I mean, flying over the world to take Instagram photos of ourselves, like we'll be okay without that world. We'll actually be probably happier. And the process of sort of finding our way back to better relations with each other and with lands and seas and waters is, I think, an enormously fulfilling and creative project, as much as it is, of course, a frightening one because of the stakes of it all. So, when I teach people, or when I talk to people about these problems, I try to really also convey my sense, not of a sort of an empty sense of hope, but of a sense of sort of purpose that, out of these ruins, something else will arise, and we actually get a chance to shape what comes next, which most generations don't get. And so there's something about that we should honor that responsibility and be present for the challenges, even though they are many. And again, I want to acknowledge the emotions because they're real, but also say, like, there is another way of engaging this, and that little things matter too, because again, this is one of the counterintuitive principles of decarbonization. If all of us just did less, rather than working harder at being green, we actually would accomplish our goals faster. There's a way in which simply staying put, being quiet, is, and really some of the greatest pleasures and leisures we have available to us are low carbon. Simony and I have a whole other project we're working on called Low Carbon Pleasure, Low Carbon Leisure, which is simply about taking these overheated pleasure circuits of petromodernity and sort of creating experimental practices to show that actually most of the things you really enjoy doing don't require a lot of carbon. So the stuff you're giving up is the kind of frivolous petro thrills, but you're actually not going to miss them that much. You can be quite happy and fulfilled in other ways. And so, there's like there's a case to be made for ethical laziness, for just, not doing as much, not working so hard. Yeah. And I think everyone can connect to that idea, right? Sometimes it's just by not doing that you can make a positive contribution to the future. Anyway, so again, that's a ramble on a ramble, but thank you for the question, because it's, again, something that goes very close to the heart of my thinking about these matters and about, finding the courage to keep going.
Thanks. Can I just make a small comment on that? I think thinking about the future is quite a difficult thing. That I think that it is quite fun. It's quite a fun process, and I think that anthropology, because of its like kind of comparative tradition, I think that it is uniquely positioned to think about the future in some ways, because we're comfortable with alternatives, I guess, to our own reality, which is exciting. I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
And thank you for putting in the plug for anthropology, which I agree, because the great advantage of anthropology on these matters, there's a lot of good reasons to be an anthropologist and to study it, but particularly when facing like the climate emergency, is the knowledge and the wisdom, perhaps, that there have been many different human cultures and societies over time, and really only one of them has driven us to planetary ecocide, right? So rather than thinking of this as an inevitability of the human condition, which of course, again, those who uphold the status quo would like us to think, well, this is just our human nature. There's no way we couldn't, drive ourselves into this situation. No, most human cultures and societies have not come anywhere near this, and they've done pretty well for themselves, over time. And that, again, a humility, I think, of recognizing that is something that one can take inspiration from. There's a plasticity to human nature and culture that we shouldn't underestimate in our ability to sort of find a way, and ingenuity to find a way past this particular set of extremely toxic practices.
Great, thank you very much. The floor is open, and anyone is more than welcome to put up their hand, or they can unmute and go ahead. Stephen, I won't let you ask a question just yet, but anyone else is more than welcome, please. That can be a comment, it can be a question. MIA, sorry, I don't see your full name. Go ahead. You just unmuted, you can go ahead if that was a purposeful hand. Yes.
It was a purposeful hand, thank you. Sorry, I'm actually not from the University of Stellenbosch, I'm from the University of Pretoria. And I'm a climate change scientist, so this has been a very interesting seminar from someone coming rather from the more biophysical side. I just wanted to comment, I found this particularly interesting because Mexico was actually held up as a model for South Africa in climate change negotiations and policy and planning in the last 10 or 15 years. So it's been very interesting to hear this deconstructed. A little less so, I would say, in the last 5 years, but certainly 10 or 15 years ago, Mexico was considered as a key example for South Africa in terms of both energy policy and climate policy. So it's been very interesting to hear this unpacked. It's a critical view that we don't always take on the climate change science side, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. And I agree. I mean, I wanted to convey in some ways also my true estimation of what the Calderon agenda was in terms of being ahead of its time, more ambitious, more sort of ambitious in the scope of its thinking than most countries, including especially the United States at that time. And so this idea that there's leadership can come from many different places in the world, I think is something we really want to embrace. And I don't, again, I think there are aspects of the Mexican renewable energy decarbonization project that are worth, seriously considering in other contexts. It wasn't so much the ambition or scale of the plan that was the problem, it was the implementation and the range of partners that were considered. And, we wrote this out in our final report to NSF that, if some of these companies had simply taken a very different and more respectful approach to community relationships, if they had tried to engage communities, if they had tried to talk to communities about what they really hope to get from this development, if they had made more accommodations for the interests beyond profit, sheer profit that was being made, it could have gone a lot better, and it would have created a situation in which we would not only have a lot more renewable energy available, but also communities that felt that this had been worthwhile for them. And that was not moving in this sort of colonial history. Unfortunately, that's not the route that was chosen. And I think you understand why not, because it's easier to slip into the grooves of extractivist energy practices because that's what we've been doing for a long time. That's why I think we need more experimental practices. We need to be thinking outside and beyond the habits of the past in terms of imagining what a future could make. And it doesn't mean that we have to slow things down to do that. I think it can still happen quickly, but it has to happen with a different set of values informing it.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to pop up a hand? Stephen, can I ask my question first, Stephen, and then you can ask yours?
Absolutely. There was a gap there, so I was waiting for someone.
Okay, cool. But that's also not to say that the rest of the group can not ask a question. But yeah, my question sort of links off what both of the discussants raised and what you spoke about at the end of your response to Carla was regarding this model of growth and extractivist logic regarding obviously energy production and so on, and then maybe not the extractivist logic, but certainly the growth logic of and the capitalist logic of renewables, right? So, and maybe this gives you room to talk about, as you were saying, the cosmology and mythology of wind in these spaces. Are there, what sort of community projects, and if, sort of what is the nature of those projects, if there are, that have perhaps before wind parks were established or thought of, like, as you were saying, in the 70s, were there ways in which communities on the ground were already leveraging wind power? So different ways of leveraging this resource rather than just thinking of it as a way to generate energy and therefore capital. Have communities just sort of thought of it as a deterrence to their livelihoods and a problem rather than what are some of the methods and ways of interacting with this with wind and with this natural resource that isn't thought through of the logic of the capitalist logic? Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. That's a great question. I'm glad I have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the cosmology of wind in the region. So, in the two indigenous communities that have the greatest land holdings tradition in the region are the Binisa or the Zapotec people and the Ikots or Wave people. And the Wave and Binisa, Binisa and Ikots have had historically a lot of contention amongst themselves, and only came together in a sense through the wind opposition to the wind parks. It was sort of historical as a kind of pan-indigenous resistance movement. But the Ikots historically fisher folk living along the sandbars and the coastline of the most southern part of the isthmus, and I think they have had great respect, for the wind as a force, both respecting its powers and ability, to help them sail and to do their fishing, but also as something that has a kind of ontological force, and that in their sort of cosmology is associated with the origin of the world. The word in Binisa for life, the animating life force, the prefix B, which every living creature has the word or the syllable B within its name. That is also the word for the wind, and particularly for the north wind, which is seen to be a kind of wind of creation. And when Christianization came, interestingly, because the Christians couldn't tolerate any greater God than their God, it began to be reconfigured as the devil's wind, and so you will hear these sort of associations with it as a kind of as an evil force. But really, historically, as far as we could reconstruct, it is a positive force, a life-affirming force, really just a recognition of the power of the Earth systems to sort of breathe life into human communities, and so, in the sense of, it's hard to think of it as a resource in a kind of a model of like settler development in a way, because, I think that it was something other than that. It was part of the sort of the mesh of elemental powers that generated the world. And I'm sure people didn't like being pelted in the head by stones. None of us like it when it happens, and this would happen in the worst wind. I think the lesson to be taken was less, yes, perhaps a sort of a day-to-day irritant, but also just a kind of a sense of the kind of existential power that it conveys. I mean, that's how I think it's come through both mythology and then more recently through the work of artists and poets that we've worked with. Victor Terran's poetry appears in our work as somebody who's written about the great north wind and its power to jam corn cobs in your nose. And you get a sense from reading contemporary Binisa, especially sort of artists, that the wind remains this resource for the imagination in the way it probably always did. So it's a bit, to the extent that it was used in a way that would be generative of something, I don't know, as a resource, no, I don't think so. Not in the sense that people were building their own windmills, but I do think it had an important place, in fact, an essential place as part of those lifeways in those communities ancestrally.
Great, thank you very much. Stephen, go ahead.
Are there any other hands? Because we're approaching, we've got a bit of time, so let's just see. Anybody else? Okay, but then I'll have to pose a set of thoughts that are not very composed, because there's so much that one could go into here. But I was struck by something you said early on, that there's nothing inherent in the technology itself. So wind power or solar could lead to all sorts of outcomes, but if we go the route of how it inserts itself or is inserted into structures of, for want of a better word, capitalism, then there seems almost like an inevitability. So it takes on the form of a pattern structure that, and here I'm thinking about Nancy Fraser's recent essay, New Left Review, which we read in the same class that we read your duograph. So she's calling for trans-environmental eco-socialism because she believes that capitalism is self-cannibalizing at a deep structural level. It undermines its own conditions of possibility and in the way destroys the environment, social reproduction, possibly all the rest. So it sounds a bit overdetermined, maybe, but yet your own empirical research leads one to think that that may be right. There's something that this technology cannot resolve. It can be, one can still be an advocate for this above fossil fuel driven infrastructures and so forth, but it can't fix the things that are really broken. It can, it can't, so I'm just interested in where your findings go in terms of thinking through these critiques of capitalism. You say you agree there shouldn't be some singularity to capitalism in your book. I forget who you're citing there. That there's no such thing as capitalism, but yet there's a powerful structuring to what's going on in these different sites. So I'll leave it at that. So it is quite vague and rambling. I think this is a day of rambling, but hopefully we can get at something else.
No, Stephen, thank you. That was a terrific. And there's a lot of, I think a good ramble is the best thing. I mean, again, it's kind of like a situationist derive. It's a sort of wandering across a landscape and stopping to marvel at the fascinating things you have there. So I'm all in favor of, this is a pro rambling message here. So, but let me say, I think you raise a lot of really interesting points about this, and maybe I can delve a little bit more into that. I don't know, I haven't read that Fraser piece, but I think if I heard it right, trans-environmental socialism, something like that, sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm willing to give that an audience.
Climates of capital, and then there's a subtitle. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'll check it out. Thank you for that tip. So, and I do mention that, apropos of, Marx never uses the term capitalism, which surprises a lot of people to hear. But I find in that, and he talks a lot about capital, and he talks about the sort of the dynamics and the dialectics of capital formation. But he never accepts this idea that we're living in a system, which I like. I like the fact that we can, because if you get past the idea, like, you can't, how do you break apart a system that's global, that has truly, as Marx predicted, now come to involve nearly all of us humans on the planet within its, wage labor system in one way or another, wage labor relations rather. And if we don't want to, accept that as our sort of ordained from above condition, then then things actually begin to look a little less hopeless, honestly. And I think about the projects of decoupling. I mean, some of the degrowth experiments that are going on, for example, in participatory and autonomous urbanism in places like Barcelona and Madrid in Spain, but also increasingly in other cities, where there's always so much interesting political work being done right now and cultural work being done, oftentimes at a very humble level, at the level of a block or a building. That again, these are projects that, well, what does it matter if one block or one neighborhood in Barcelona decides that they're going to create cooperatives and to self-supply themselves with needed things, including energy. I mean, there's a very interesting energy cooperative now in Catalonia, that Som Energia, that is doing work not only to sort of create a participatory cooperative nonprofit energy supply system, but also to counsel people on how to use less energy, which honestly is a big part of this. And I think we get into an area that some scholars are terming energy ethics. There's a group and a center at St. Andrews University that's focusing on energy ethics and doing some very important work there now. And so we know sort of the part of the problem we've been really focused on is decarbonization. Like, how do we shift our use, our sort of resource mix and our infrastructures away from fossil fuels towards low carbon energy sources. And that is an important project. But the other side of it is questioning why we use the energy we use, the ethics of the kinds of energy practices we have. And that receives a lot less attention, honestly, unfortunately, because my thinking is that we actually really need to do both of these at the same time, and especially in the global north. I'm going to speak, from the perspective of a place like Houston, which is probably the least sustainable city in the world in a lot of ways. Helped sort of build the model of automobility-driven suburbia that has, colonized many sort of urban peripheries across the planet now. But that's incredibly energy intensive and resistant, to sort of projects, pedestrian, just walking down a street feels like a political act in Houston, because in kind of the whole urban landscape is fighting against you trying to walk somewhere. There aren't sidewalks. It's an insane place. But that's also, yes, it's an infrastructure question, but it's also an ethical question. And that's why, as I said, I think part of what has to happen is in the global north especially, is a querying as to, the way we use energy, the magnitudes of energy we use, are they necessary? Are they necessary for a good life? What a good life is that makes us happy? Or how much of this is actually sort of self-sabotaging, in some ways undermining ourselves through a culture of work and productivity that is really not necessary to lead a life that I think most of us would feel happy with, right? How much of this is just excess for the sake of excess? And when you have these cases of these Bill Gates type figures who have more money than whole nations and yet who only sleep 4 hours a night, you say Marx's theory of alienation is right. Like his theory of alienation is spot on. That there's no winner in this system. The capitalists are just the mushrooms growing on the rotten log of capital, right? What we need to do is to get rid of this sort of labor alienation, this work culture, this thirst for productivity as an end in itself, right? The kind of Weberian Protestant ethic, just work. The point of this is to just make more and more and more, not to enjoy it, not to hoard it even, but just to keep reinvesting your capital back into your system to just generate more and more. It's a way of being that doesn't, I think, actually produce a lot of happiness. And if the argument is, if we change the system, we'll lose our happiness, I think that we can really question that, and we can really create prototypes and experiments of alternate ways of modern living that will show that, in fact, we can be just, in fact, probably more happy doing a lot less. And this was the promise of, again, when we think about what Marx was promising us, famously, he doesn't tell us what a communist society looks like, but we have some clues from the Grundrisse. And those clues are that the system that capital has developed, the best system in the history of the world for producing useful objects, we somehow get to hold on to that, right? But because so much of this is automated or machine driven, the amount of time we actually need to put into sort of sustaining this modern life is actually shrinking. And that's a good thing, as long as we don't criminalize inability to find work, right? As long as we don't tell people the only way you can live in this society is if you have a wage laboring job, right? If we take that part out of it and we say, actually, it's okay if you only work 10 hours a week, because that's all that's needed socially to sort of maintain this, and take the rest of that time to relax or to spend time with your kids or to go fishing or have a walk in the park or whatever it is that you find joy in. I think that's actually what we're moving towards, and this is why these discussions of universal basic incomes are so important, and degrowth sort of models of economy. I think we're on the cusp of a radical redefinition of what modern life is. And then the question, especially from the point of view of South Africa, I'm sure this is on your mind, is how do we make that globally available? How do we make sure that nobody's being left behind, that this isn't just another nice thing that the palaces of the north get to enjoy while there's misery only available to the south? That's another project and another politics. But I think that as the north itself realizes, and it has to, that there is no future. Well, okay, Jeff Bezos believes we can get on rockets and go to the moon, but I think he's going to find he's not happy there either. And even if he gets to Mars, he's going to find that a pretty miserable existence, right? So these are just, these are just the hallucinations of people clinging to a world that is passing them by. But for the rest of us, I think we're going to be on Earth. We want to be happy. We want to have we want to be able to pass a world down to our children that is not hopeless and that is not compromised by toxicity and pollution and warming and all the other things that are sort of the trajectories we suffer today. And so I think that this something exciting is coming, and I do think, and it's something we can all participate in, because again, humble, small little projects are the one that matter. Ultimately, the seeds of things that make sense in local communities to different groups of people. And I guess you could say it's a bit in the spirit of somebody like David Graeber, the famous, and unfortunately we've lost him recently, but a kind of an idea of needing to rise to the demands of our time. But to do it in a way that's not just saying, well, we'll leave it to the state to figure it out, or we'll leave it to the market to figure it out. We can all get involved in the process of figuring this out. And there are so many, again, exciting experiments and new ways of living, including urban ways of living that around the world now, that I think there's a lot to take heart and inspiration from, and a lot of places to get busy, or not. Maybe a lot of places just to get lazy, as I said before. Maybe that part of it is, again, not working ourselves to death to try to overcome the work culture and the productivity obsession of Protestant, capitalist modernity. There's another round.
Thanks very much. Are there more questions? I mean, while we're waiting, I can see there's a lot of applauding of what you said, virtual applauding. So clearly the way you responded there, I think, was great. And in this course where we read, the kind of literatures, including your work, around these critiques of carbon capitalism, we also looked at the basic income grant. So there are a whole range of things happening in South Africa right now that are about crisis, but small opportunities. So when you come to South Africa, for example, I can take you to a place I went to in my hometown, Ixtepec, which is now called that name. It used to be Port Elizabeth. And Janet Cherry and a whole range of people, she's an activist academic there at the university there. They've got essentially what you were describing in Barcelona. It's community-based solar project at street level, and they sell the electricity back to the grid and use that for community stuff. And so it's a very, I found it fascinating to see how they put this together. So these ideas are happening all over the world and at different scales and so forth. So I do share your sense of the old is busy dying, and there are indications of possibility emerging. Any other final comments? I think it's been a wonderful talk and discussion. So yeah, both of them. I mean, so we've been very privileged. I'm all for duographs from now on, because it really provoked us to think about a whole range of issues. The discussants were superb. Sophia and Carla, thank you very much, and Matthew for facilitating this. So any final comments? as we sort of a little bit over the time, but that's not a problem at all. I could continue here rambling for another hour or two, but any final comment from you, Dominic?
I'll just say thanks, and it's been a privilege to be here. We're so happy to share our work with you, and to have a chance to really sort of deep dive into some of the interesting philosophical and economic and futurist issues that these projects involve. And I love how the work is being pushed now towards thinking about futures, which I think is great when you have a work. Anthropology is always a bit historical because you publish things years sometimes after the events happen, and so you always feel like you're writing a kind of a recent history. But when we can actually use those recent histories to inform our thinking about our contemporary issues, then that's, I think, anthropology at its best. So thank you for staging in this way. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation and for the engagement. And I just look forward to more to come. So I hope that this is not the end of anything, but the beginning of a great new set of relationships.
Great. And we look forward to welcoming you and Simone when you arrive, because hopefully it will be in the near future.
We hope so, etc. We'll have to put an asterisk next to any plan, but we're optimistic we will get there. We'll get there someday soon, hopefully.
Right. Excellent. Thanks very much, Dominic.
Cheers. Thank you
to everyone for really
bye. Take care. Thank you for listening.
Sessions.
Thanks all. Thanks so much.
Bye.